Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session on sponsorship, diversifying the pipeline of emerging leaders in our schools. As you're joining the room, we have you entering on mute, and we'll ask that you please keep yourself muted until we open up for questions. But we would like you to check your name or your name in your square, so to speak, and please make sure that your full name and your school name is showing there so that we all know who we are with today. We'll give it one more minute before we formally get started. Please know that we are recording this session and we will be sharing it out with everyone who has registered for this session today. And we also will be sharing out the slides as well. So if that relieves your need to take notes, we always find that's helpful to let you know in advance. And again, if you're just joining us, please check your square on the screen and rename yourself if your full name and your school name are not appearing. We're going to wait just a few more seconds to get started. And with that, I think we will get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on sponsorship, diversifying the pipeline of emerging leaders in our schools. I am very pleased to welcome our speaker this morning and also to acknowledge and welcome Storbeck Search, which is supporting this session today. We are very grateful for their support, and I would be remiss not to mention that Storbeck Search recruited Tunya Morris, who is speaking for us, to her current position at the Pingree School. I also want to thank the rest of the Advis staff for all of their work this year, Mary Cardona, Candace Wilson, and Jennifer Braxton. And it is my great pleasure to welcome and introduce for the very first time to an Advis audience, the new president-elect of Advis, Yanni Hill-Gill. Yanni, you want to quick wave hi so we can all...
Hi, everyone. Good to see you all. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And we're so glad that you could join us today. So it is now my pleasure to welcome and introduce Tunya Morris, who is the lower school director at the Pingree School in Short Hills, New Jersey. Previously, Tunya was assistant head of school at St. Edmund's Academy in Pittsburgh. An advocate for diversifying the many faces of leadership, her study on career sponsorship, which examined the sponsorship experiences of 325 school heads and 30 female heads of color, was featured in the fall edition of Independent School magazine. Advis was very pleased to support Tunya's research that informed the article, which also became her dissertation for a doctoral degree in educational leadership from the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education, which she received without ceremony right after the pandemic was getting underway last spring. So Tunya, thank you so much for sharing this with us today. And with that, I will turn the mic over to you.
Thanks, Barbara. I'm going to just take a moment and share my screen. Great. Well, thanks everyone. I'm really excited to be here today when Jennifer Braxton reached out to me and asked me if I would be willing to present for Advis. I responded with an absolute yes. I'm really excited to be here and a little bit about myself before we get started. So I started my career in independent schools in New York City. Started as a teacher at the Nightingale Bamford School. And during that time, I was mentored by a group of strong female leaders in the area who then encouraged me to pursue graduate studies at the Klingenstein Center. So I am a proud alum of Klingenstein. I did the Summer Institute for Earlier Career Educators, as well as the one-year master's program. Following that time, I then moved to Pittsburgh, where I had met a head of school, Chad Barnett, at St. Edmunds Academy. And during that time, he took me under his wing. And I started there as an academic dean and director of curriculum. And then he later promoted me to the role of assistant head of school. And, I share this with you, I share my personal journey with you because throughout my career, I really have benefited from strong mentors and sponsors who have supported me along my journey. And then I also want to just give a shout out to Dr. Sherry Coleman as well of Storbeck. She has also, a lot of the research that she has done on racial identity in independent schools has really inspired me to take a look at this concept of sponsorship. And it was also during my time at Penn that I took a closer look at race and gender dynamics in independent schools. And I'm just really excited to have an opportunity to share this with you, this part of my research with you today. So today's agenda is I'm going to share with you some recent research that NIS has published on headship. Some of this may be surprising, some of this may be new to you. And then I'm going to delve into the research that I conducted during my doctoral research in the mid-career program at Penn. And then finally, I'm going to share with you some limitations actually that were revealed with sponsors, and specifically some challenges that have that emerged from the research in terms of racial and gender dynamics that surfaced. And then we'll just end with I have some reflecting questions for this group, and then also I'll open it up to Q&A at the end. So NIS, is wonderful just in terms of all the data that they collect. And, if we look at the state of headships for the past 2 decades, you'll see here that female heads of color, roughly about a third of heads in independent schools are women. And this percentage has actually remained relatively stagnant. You'll see that there was a slight increase of 2% recently. And additionally, the percentage of heads of color also is relatively low. However, there has been a gradual increase in the percentage of heads of color over the past couple of years. Now, this actually begs us to ask the question, is this a pipeline issue? And here you'll see this is actually a demographic. This is a breakdown of the percentage of senior administrators at NIS schools who identify as women. And if you look at these numbers, you'll see that the majority of senior administrators, associate heads, or directors of institutional advancement are in fact women. Additionally, there's also previous research that Ara Brown conducted while he was also in the mid-career doctoral program at Penn. He actually did a research on heads of color, and he found that heads of color were more likely to be graduates of independent schools. He also found that they were more likely to have held senior administrative positions prior to their first appointment to headships. And then also they were more likely to have a terminal degree. And then, for the past 2 or 3 decades or so, one of the things that I looked at my research was the fact that over the 2 to 3 decades, we've also seen a rise in affinity groups, specifically in independent schools. And these networks, have an opportunity. They can influence the career trajectory of women and also of people of color. And I know that I've shared that I personally have benefited from these networks. But it was years ago when I participated in the Kingswood Oxford Leadership Institute. This was founded by Dennis Bisgard, a leadership institute for educators of color. It was during this time that I learned more about mentorship and the concept of mentorship, which then inspired me to actually look at mentorship and to look at sponsorship in independent schools. I'm going to delve into the research that I conducted while at Penn. There were a couple of questions that I was really interested in exploring. The first one was I wanted to have a better understanding of how sponsorship had influenced the appointments of heads of school in independent schools. Secondly, I wanted to know whether or not there were differences in how heads of school have experienced sponsorship with regard to their gendered and also racial interactions with their primary sponsors. And then the third question that I was really interested in exploring was whether or not sponsorship also influence the career mobility of female heads of color. So for the research, I administered a survey to independent school heads as well as head elects at NAS schools. And roughly, there were 325 heads who actually completed the survey. This is out of about 1,600 school heads. Additionally, I also interviewed 30 female heads of color for this research. So this was a very large research study that captured a large percentage of heads of school. Some demographics. Here you see these are the head of school demographics from the survey that was administered. So about half of the heads of school that completed the survey were men, slightly over half, and then slightly under half of the participants were women. The majority of the participants in the survey identified as white or Caucasian, and then roughly 20% of the heads that completed the survey were people of color. I'm going to go through now some questions that I had asked in the survey and what the responses were. When I asked the heads whether or not they had a sponsor, over half of the participants indicated that they had at least one sponsor prior to their first appointment to a headship. I then proceeded to ask some questions about the sponsors that these heads of school had prior to their first headship. You can see here that over half of the sponsors that they had identified were male, and about a third of the heads of school indicated that their sponsors were women. Additionally, I learned that roughly 91% of the sponsors that had been identified were white or Caucasian. So just kind of note this, in the back of your head, that the majority of sponsors that heads of school had identified were white. I also learned that most sponsors were current or retired heads of school, or they were trustees at independent schools. And then this was kind of interesting. This was an interesting finding here. I also asked the heads to share with me the number of years the sponsors had been, their sponsors had been involved in independent schools. And you'll see here that 73% of the sponsors that have been identified have been involved in independent schools in some way for 20 or more years. Additionally, we also learned that heads of color were more likely to have sponsors of color, and white heads of school were more likely to have white sponsors. And this was, in fact, a statistically significant difference that we found in the research. There were also questions in the survey around conversations about racial and gendered interactions that took place between these heads of school as well as their sponsors. And kind of the headline of this graphic is that we found that when sponsors engaged in conversations with these heads, when they engaged in conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, that the level of racial stress between sponsors as well as their proteges was actually lower. And then it was also the case that when there were more DEI conversations between sponsors and their proteges, that the sponsor was actually perceived as being more competent. I think this is important to note because what we learned was that conversations about identity, racial identity, gendered identity, conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, in fact, they actually improved the quality of relationships between sponsors and their proteges. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to share with you some of the qualitative data that surfaced from the interviews that I conducted with 30 female heads of color in independent schools. I asked for these interviews, I had asked these women to share with me, to describe kind of the behaviors that their sponsors exhibited. And I also asked them ways in which they felt like their sponsors really benefited their career mobility and career trajectory. So just a couple of highlights here. One, I mentioned earlier that this is a mutual relationship, sponsorship. And one of the things that came up in the research was that the women actually shared that they felt like they could be vulnerable with their sponsors. There was a great deal of trust that they had with their sponsors. And specifically, in cases where these female heads of color, again, this is prior to their appointment to their first headship, in cases where the sponsor was someone who they reported to, there was trust in their ability to lead and to make decisions in independent schools. The other behavior that sponsors exhibited was sponsors specifically presented opportunities for these women of color to develop their skill set. And they did so actually by not by over mentoring and micromanaging, but in fact, they gave them what I like to call are their real, their juicy tasks is the way I think of it. They actually put them into positions where they were overseeing committees and having influence on programmatic initiatives. Accreditation was another piece that came up. And then they also gave these women of color opportunities to manage budgets and to interact with trustees at the school. This was really important. I think it's important just to highlight the financial piece because fundraising was something that these women of color had highlighted as something that they had benefited from prior to becoming heads of school. We also learned that sponsors were critical in promoting these women. They promoted them internally, appointing them to, again, senior leadership roles. Sometimes it was a lateral move. The other thing that sponsors engaged in was that they also, in other cases, if they did not appoint these women to a current role, they also created new roles for these women of color so that they could continue to grow within the institution. And then finally, there were also a good number of women who shared that they stepped into the role, into interim headships if their heads had actually stepped away. And this was really important because it indicated to the school that they were ready for headship, and that there was a great deal of trust in these women. Social capital was another aspect that came up. The women reported that their sponsors gave them access to people, to different networks. These were people who had knowledge about independent schools. In other cases, these were people who later went on to advocate for them when they were in head searches. And then I mentioned governance a little bit earlier, but again, these women they were given opportunities to work with trustees. In other cases, they were even placed on boards, local boards, and this also gave them more opportunities to learn more about governance in independent schools. Endorsements was another aspect that came up as well. High impact sponsors actually increased the visibility of women of color. And then they also increased their credibility as well, simply by the way in which they talked about the accomplishments of these women. This is really important to note because I had mentioned earlier, the research indicates that for women and also for people of color, that they're undervalued and also perceived as not being credible. And so when there is a sponsor who had a great deal of social capital, essentially endorsing these women of color, that played a significant role in their career mobility. A couple of things too, I share with you that I had asked these women, what ways did they feel like they benefited from sponsorship? And there were a couple of things that came up. So the first is the women reported that they felt more confident by having at least one sponsor. They also reported that they felt like they developed a level of competence. Specifically, they developed skills to lead in independent schools. And then finally, the credibility and visibility aspects were really important as well. They felt like the sponsors, and again, most of these sponsors were, as reported in the survey, were white. They were also men. They were also older men. And they benefited from ways in which these men had talked about them in order to boost their credibility. And then finally, the visibility was another aspect that these women also shared as well. So all of this is to say, this is a relationship. It's a mutual relationship that is between two individuals. A sponsor is typically a senior person, and it's a senior person who goes out of their way to develop the skill set of a protege. And the sponsor can also promote a protege and expand their visibility and credibility. The other thing too is that when there is a protege, I think it's important to note that these individuals demonstrated a high level of performance. They were effective in their jobs, and they also added a great deal of value to a sponsor's reputation and brand as well. And kind of where does this kind of takes us, right? The thing is that there's also research out there outside of independent schools, but in the business world, that suggests that women and people of color are in fact they're over mentored and they're under sponsored. And so if you look at this graphic here, this was actually published by Sylvia Ann Hewlett in 2013. And I really like this. It's simplistic, but I think it kind of gets to the point here, where a mentor essentially is someone who serves as a counsel, someone who offers support, and that's beneficial. And a sponsor is someone who takes it to kind of another level. And the outcome is that it could lead to the career advancement of individuals. It's also the case that one individual could be a mentor and a sponsor at the same time at different junctures. So a couple of limitations that I want to highlight because I spent a lot of time, I think, highlighting the benefits of having a sponsor. I mentioned earlier that these the relationship is basically it's inherently relational, but when challenges in racial interactions, in gendered interactions come up, it can lead to an erosion in trust. So that is a limitation potentially. The other thing is for women and people of color, if there's any difficulty in networking or even attracting sponsors, that can also be a struggle that comes up as well. I mentioned earlier, I think it's important to note too, that the majority of the sponsors that had been identified in the survey were much older. And so when there are challenges related to relationships, intergenerational differences, that can also be a limitation in whether or not this is a successful relationship. And then finally, kind of something else that was interesting that came up in the interviews with women of color is there's also the pet to threat phenomenon, whereby a protege, as they continue on their journey of being developed by the sponsor, there were times when the protege started to, they performed quite well on the job. And a sponsor would kind of sponsor them up to a certain point, in part because they felt threatened by the protege. And this led at some point to losing a sponsor. And then the other piece too that I want to mention is some of the women also relied on one sponsor. And again, this kind of came at a detriment if the relationship evolved in a more negative way in time. Now, I mentioned earlier, you know, the the other thing that I think too is important to mention here is that the most impactful sponsors didn't feel threatened by their proteges. In fact, they were very generous, they were very kind to their proteges, and they encouraged them to go on and pursue headships. But I do think it's important to just mention that there were some limitations that came up as well. So as I come to a close with this presentation, I have some questions for this group that I'd love for you to just think about. What aspects of the research findings resonate with you? What opportunities do you envision? And what questions remain for you? And I'll pause here and I'll stop sharing my screen and we can open it up for a Q&A.
Thank you, Tunya. I have a question that was sent to me, so I'll lead off with that while people gather their thoughts. What did the women report about the culture of their schools? The frame of the question is, in many of our independent schools, there is a culture of critique as the highest expression of intellectual firepower. Were women more likely to succeed in cultures where affirmation, kindness, and academic potential or effort are the oft expressed values, more so than in schools that pride themselves on more traditional values of excellence and rigor? Did you have any insights from your findings?
That's a great question. So I didn't ask specifically questions about school culture. The questions were primarily targeted towards relationships that these heads of school had with their sponsors. What I will say though, something that was interesting that came up in my interviews with the female heads of color was, you know, in some cases, there was a level of what I'll call swallowing in order to maintain the integrity of their relationship. That there were some things that they had to sacrifice about themselves because in order to maintain the relationship and benefit from it. That was something that came up in the qualitative interviews. And then there were also other female heads of color who had phenomenal sponsors where they felt truly as if they could be their authentic selves. And that was also beneficial as well. Great question.
Thank you. That makes sense too. Feel free to grab the mic, anyone who would like to either ask a question or share an observation.
I was wondering if the sponsor relationships, were they in all cases volunteer relationships or were they more formal? Can you talk a little bit more about how you define a sponsorship or a sponsor?
Yep, absolutely. This was interesting. So I would characterize, I think in many of the relationships, they started as informal. Some of them started through, for instance, the affinity groups. Like I shared with you a photo of the Kingswood Oxford Institute. And for that institute, at least when I participated in it, I was actually matched with the head of school. who continues to guide me even to this day. In most of the cases, the sponsor turned out to be the head of school. So these were women who they started out as educators. They then moved into deanships. They moved on to division director roles, and their sponsors were their heads. And then in other cases, the sponsors was also a trustee, either at their current school or a trustee at another school. So these are relationships that actually started off, I would say, as professionally, and then they transition into friendships.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I've learned the power of the pause in Zoom, especially.
I was going to actually ask this group if there was anything that was surprising.
Tunya, I did have a thought, maybe a question when you were speaking about sometimes the sponsorship ended early because of your pet or threat assessment. And you mentioned, I think, that the sponsor would back off. But I imagine often it would lead to the departure of the sponsoree early, if there was a sense of that. Was there any evidence of that?
There actually was. So it's interesting that you bring that up, and this came up in the interviews that I conducted. But when that took place, and I think once the women felt like their heads were no longer supporting them in a way in which they supported, a decision had to be made in terms of whether or not they were going to depart the school. And in these instances, in a couple of instances where it came up, the women actually did move on to other schools. And in fact, they had to break away from those relationships.
Through the research, did you come away with sort of a ranking of the most important qualities of a sponsor? For example, would it be, if you had to choose, would it be a sponsor who can allow their mentor to be their most authentic self? Or would it be a sponsor that can provide the most opportunities for visibility or connections?
There was no ranking, but I would say it was all of the above. It was all of the above, and there's an art to it as well. And I think I was trying to allude this earlier, that it truly is a relationship that's based on trust. I would say, that the sponsors as well also demonstrated through their support that they had these women's back. And I think that's important because there were challenges that came up in independent schools that these women of color had experienced. And not all of their decisions had been supported. But when the head of school lent their support and stepped in when necessary to speak on behalf of these women of color, it really made a difference. And it also helped to build their credibility within the organization as well.
Thanks.
So we have a question submitted in the chat that I might also ask our search consultants to speak to after you do, Tunya. But that is, did your research reveal the percentage of heads who advanced from external affairs, so development or enrollment management positions, versus the academic side of schools? And I'm curious to what extent head of school position descriptions are written with a preference for experience in the teaching academic roles versus the other side of that equation, and how this influences who is sponsored.
That's a great question. I'm only going to reference the research that I did. The majority of the participants, and for women and people of color specifically, actually their trajectory towards headship was more traditional. And by that, what I mean is they were more often division directors, academic deans, directors of curriculum prior to their first headships. And I think, do we have Sherry on this call as well?
We have Sherry and we have Stacy Williams-Sealy. Yep. Sherry, what are you seeing?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yes, I would agree with Tunya, probably particularly for women of color. You know, there seems to be another layer of prove yourself that other people may not experience. However, in headships now, we're seeing a bit shift of emphasis on people who can come from DI backgrounds, you know, who can come from development, who can come from admission, but a lot has to do with exactly what Tunya said about sponsorship. What type of work were they able to do internally in their school community? You know, were they able to have or sit or experience or understand the financial aspects of the organization? Were they able to do some work in marketing? So it goes back to what she said, given opportunities. And so I think we are seeing more women, particularly women of color, who may come from DI backgrounds or may come from admission background. So, you know, that sponsorship and giving one opportunities matters most, I think. Stacey, I don't know whether you wanted to add something more to that.
Yep. And I would say in general, from where I sit, I have seen more movement towards hiring from other areas
Yes.
than academic backgrounds.
Yes.
Yes. So
I see that Sally has a question
Yep.
as well. Do I have thoughts on how heads can support and promote leaders of color in their schools? Yes. Well, you know, I would say don't wait for a person of color to ask to be sponsored. You know, I think it's important to take a proactive position, especially as you're looking at talent within your schools or your organizations, because that was another piece as well. There were a couple of instances where the protege actually reached out to a head of school and asked, hey, could you sponsor me? But in the majority of the cases, sponsors, I kind of think of them as they're like talent managers. They scanned their institutions and they identified talent, and then they went ahead and they just made shifts within the school in order to give leadership opportunities to women and people of color. And then the other thing too is they promoted them to actual roles and they changed their titles. That was one aspect that came up in the study where it really did accelerate the career advancement of the women that I interviewed.
And I would just note, we have several heads of color on with us this morning. So if anyone would like to speak up and add your experience and insights at any point, please do. So Stacy Williams-Sealy said that she had a similar questions to Sally. What implications might this have on training and support for heads? How did then receiving sponsorship impact their inclination to later sponsor? And perhaps.
No, that's a great question. So the interesting thing is, again, this is more qualitative, just coming from the interviews, is that those that benefited from high impact sponsors, those that benefited from sponsoring relationships, actually went on to sponsor many other educators who became heads of school. The other thing too was, again, I can't divulge the identity of these sponsors, but similar, there were names in independent schools, names of people, names of sponsors that kept cropping up over and over and over again. And in fact, there was even this one retired head of school who I believe she must have had there were like, I don't know, like 14 to 16 heads of school who referenced this retired head of school, which was really incredible. And I think that it really demonstrates the impact that the one person can have. And I think that the more that we can be generous in this way, and I think sometimes it's hard on a day-to-day basis because we're so in, you know, we're involved in the day-to-day operations of the school. But just to kind of take a step back and to find time out of our days to support one another, to support specifically women and people of color, I think can make a real difference. So I'd love to see more sponsors out there in independent schools.
Yeah, the other part of my question was about impact on training for all heads. And I think there's so many opportunities where heads are gathered, from institute to new heads to heads retreats. And I think of sponsorship as an important leadership competency that all heads ought to be thinking about, if not actively trying to develop in themselves. And so I'm just curious, you know, are you going to take the show on the road to every heads training from now until you know, till kingdom come?
Should I?
We're going to share the good word about it with our
Yes,
association
do.
colleagues. So there's a start.
Yeah.
You should
No,
take it.
I would love, no, I would love to share more of this too. And you know, I think that for there's a huge burden too on people of color who are in leadership positions, right? They take on these mentoring roles and sponsoring roles, and it takes a lot of headspace and emotional capacity in order to do this. And I think kind of the other, I think, important point to make here is the role of white men in independent schools and white women as well. But white men in particular have a really important role in sponsoring aspiring leaders, aspiring female leaders, as well as people of color too.
So we have a question from Rod Stanton. Did participants in the study comment on the challenges and opportunities of connecting proteges to networks via channels such as the NAIS annual conference, ADVIS, et cetera, during the COVID pandemic? I think you did your research prior to that, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yep, I did. My research was conducted prior to that, 2019 and 2020.
I was just thinking that there are, you know, both benefits and deficits to that. One, you can sponsor someone very publicly in a large group of people, and so that's effective. But at the same time, you're missing that, you know, personal connection, that eye contact, and the handshake that you might get in person at an annual conference.
Yeah, that's a great point. I guess that could be my next research study.
As if we want to draw out this pandemic experience. But there are some pros, like seeing everyone's faces here, as opposed, we might not connect with all the people in this room in person. Anthony asks, was the study aware of individuals who requested sponsorship or sought it and were denied? Did heads discuss decisions they made to sponsor individuals? Were feelings of equity ever a concern within organizations where one person was sponsored over others?
Yeah, this is kind of, these are actually interesting questions, and I'll share with you kind of some of the responses that were provided by the heads of school in the survey. I think, you know, one thing that came up too was that the heads reported that as they were being sponsored, there was an expectation that they were going to be, that they were high performers at school. So they had to be, the school had a benefit in some way from this relationship. The sponsor had a benefit in some way from this relationship. And so, ultimately, they had to get the work done, right? It wasn't like this was just kind of handed to them. There was an expectation that they were going to make an impact on the school's program. And that was an expectation in the relationship. When it didn't happen, I think that's when you started to see the relationships erode a little bit more. And then in some cases, the relationships did not continue on later on during during their careers. Then there's also a question, it looks like, equity over concern within organizations where one person was sponsored over others. Yes. So there were also issues of perceived, where there was a sponsor relationship, some challenges around perceived favoritism also came up in organizations. That also led to an impact on some group dynamics within senior admin teams, some of them not always beneficial. So that did come up as well. So there were issues of perceived favoritism that did take place within organizations.
Tunya, someone just asked me this question about your research, and it was if the relationship, if a head of color spoke out on issues. I mean, you did this pre-COVID and whatnot, but around racial issues, such as Black Instagram or whatnot now. But if they spoke out on racial issues or racialized issues in a way that the sponsor didn't understand or could not see, did that impact that relationship with the sponsor in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think where if the protege, and I think I shared this there was one slide around DEI conversations. But if the protege did not perceive as being safe and supported by their sponsors, it resulted in mistrust in that relationship. So in other words, heads of school that were very outspoken in support of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, right? In support of anti-racism. They were also perceived by their proteges as being more competent as well.
We have a question. I think you might have touched on this, but can you comment on the role of sponsors in helping women and people of color as they look to engage in external leadership roles in local, regional, and national independent school groups?
No, that's a great question. A lot of the sponsors served, they were crucial in serving as references. And also they played a role in referring these individuals to other leadership positions elsewhere. Actually, Sherry and Stacy, I think, might have some more insight into this as well, since they're at Storbeck.
Ace, you want to take it?
Maybe just repeat sort of the crux of the question in terms of.
Sure. It's the sponsor's role in helping women and people of color as they look to engage in external leadership roles in their local, regional, or national independent school groups and associations. So,
yeah, I mean, I don't know that we always know the path that candidates have to getting to those positions. I'm reflecting on the first head of school I worked for when I was maybe 26, 7, something like that, many years ago. And I think I may have been a pet to threat problem. I was very early on in my independent school experience. was appointed to a not a feeder even school, but a lower school board. I was invited to join that board as an outside educator, and the head of school had recommended me, and I think I was about to be sponsored, but I think I got on the pet to threat pathway, and it didn't pan out that way. I did stay on that board for 6 years, however, and it turned out to be a phenomenal and just fundamental introduction to independent school leadership and governance. And I sit on 2 boards now, so I do wonder about that. I don't know how often heads of school are necessarily thinking about it. And sometimes I think there may be concern around competition or, within a local community to go onto it, for someone to go onto another board. I've seen that crop up a little bit. So I don't know how much that is still happening. I guess I would also say that person needs to make space for the leader in their school to give a great deal of time to that effort, in leading or being part of an external organization. And time is something we all have a lot less of. So it's an important thing to think about as an idea.
Right.
And
I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to add on that too. That is really important. That piece, though, is to look for those type of external kind of opportunities, whether it's sitting on the board, engaging in NEIS or committees or conferences in some kind of way. It most certainly does build your resume and capabilities, to say, I've had some exposure, I've had some experience. And so your sponsor or even a mentor most certainly can help with that. And as Tunya mentioned earlier, sort of a good sponsor understands that, looks at one's resume, looks at one's trajectory to help them say, what else do you need to do to round out your skill set? And so whether that person is a current head of school or a sponsor, as Tunya talked about, you can have more than one sponsor, but sort of that piece is important if you can, is to engage in whether it's local, regional, or organizations outside of your school if possible.
And I was just going to add from the association perspective, and Rod just asked a question that is a good segue to this. And then Tunya, I'll ask you to respond a little more if your research revealed this in any way. But I think, just supporting with both available time and budget involvement in your local, regional, state, national associations, programs, and conferences is both a great way of providing professional development, a great way of providing networking. And with that, your involvement will raise your profile, and bring you to the attention of the leaders of those associations, which will in turn lead to invitations to present and or join up those boards. So Tunya, did your research reveal anything about that?
Yeah, a lot of it, absolutely. I think that the networking piece, I don't know about tuition reimbursement, but it really was, it was the time and effort that these sponsors put into offering the support that was really impactful. And of course, Barbara, as you mentioned, the attendance at POCC, NIS, I mean, these are all beneficial in raising your profile. And then, but importantly, they help to establish relationships with potential mentors and potential sponsors down the road. The other thing that I want to mention too, just to address are you able to comment on the role of sponsors in helping women and people of color as they look to engage in other roles as well, is that there were also, there were behind the scenes, I'll just call it's behind the scenes work that the sponsors engaged in. So it wasn't always visible. There was actually invisible work that was done. There were sponsors that made phone calls to trustees before their first appointments to headship, and they were advocating for them to hire them as heads of school. And so, and I think that's important to mention, that there's some invisible action that also takes place behind the scenes as well. I will also share with this group just kind of how I have benefited. I'm thinking of one particular sponsor who I've worked with, and she has put in a lot of time and effort for me. But she's just given me feedback, right? Like we've done mock interviews for this position. I'm currently the lower school director here at the Pingree School. And I had to, I went through kind of the first interview, and I didn't come off as warm enough. Like I needed to, up and up and up my warmth via Zoom. And I think we all know that it's kind of hard to do that, right? So I got feedback around that. I also got feedback around my dress. So she suggested that I wear a large necklace, keep it simple with solid colors. And again, and I think you're probably everyone's laughing because you're probably thinking, why on earth do you have to do this? But you have to do this, right? In order to be perceived in a certain way. Once the hire is made, that's kind of there's a different story than, in what ways do you support female heads and also heads of color. But for me, my own sponsors basically took time to show me and to explain to me the type of behavior that was expected in a search that I would not have known had I not had people just tell me, Tunya, this is what, hey, by the way, like this is how you come off. And here are some tips on how you might adjust that. And Sherry and Stacey, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts too, in terms of how, you've engaged in candidates in the search process.
I always love candidates who ask for feedback, or open to it, to say, this is, the expectation, or this is some feedback that we're getting to share with you. And I know sometimes it's difficult for consultants to really share openly and honestly. But if you are, the consultant is sometimes really working as a sponsor on your behalf, in actuality. And, and so we have seen sometimes just minor changes, whether it's by Zoom or minor changes, if you're in person, can make a difference. And so what Tunya spoke of was her openness to hear what that sponsor had to say, and openness to think about how she interviewed, to practice. And so, I had a person one time who didn't get a headship, and he came to me, and we had an honest conversation about, and I said, you've got to know how to work the room, and this is some things you need to do. And it's like from the moment you walk in, and to how you, engage with people can make a difference. And so yes, yes, it matters, that feedback and responding to it matters in this process.
I think that the feedback, and Tunya's kind to not call me out for being the one who told her that. And she and I have known each other for almost 15 years. Went to the same college, actually, not at the same time. But I think, one of the things that we encounter with candidates of color and women in the interview process is the need to balance humility and modesty, warmth and empathy with traditional leadership skills, competency, confidence, and data. These are the things I have done. These are the things I have led. We've had committees come back to us and say something as simple as, this person keeps saying we. we,
Mhm.
a group of us, we, I worked with, and I, we say back, well, isn't collaboration a fundamental competency in the leadership list? Yes, but we want to know what this person is going to do. And it is sometimes people will reveal, and sometimes people need to be coaxed a little bit around what their own biases are, what their own stereotypes are in terms of the person of color in front of them and how they are receiving that person in terms of I don't know, aura, I don't know what to call it, ambiance rather than substance and content.
Mhm.
So that is a constant just dance and conversation that when people ask us for feedback, we're really happy to engage in with them. And it's generally very well received.
That's a great point, because I think too, like for a lot of these searches, it's like people, they list all these skills, right, that they want, and then when you get to the search, it's like they're trying to they want to hire someone they like, who they connect with. And I think, and another kind of aspect that came up in the research is that these sponsors helped schools, and they also helped trustees to see these candidates for who they were. And they played an active role in that as well, because it didn't always come up in the interview process. But again, behind the scenes, they helped trustees see these candidates for who they were.
Yep. And Yanni made the point. This is another reason why unconscious bias training is significant for boards of trustees. Yep. Would anyone else like to comment or ask a question? Okay. I'm going to pause a moment. If you joined us late, I want to shout out again that this is the first ADVIS program for new ADVIS president-elect Yanni Hill-Gill, who is with us. We're pleased to welcome her. And also implicit bias in the hiring process. I did just receive that message from Sherry, which is absolutely true. We've provided some of that, and we'll continue training to do that. Well, again, I want to thank Storbeck Search for supporting this program today. It was great to have your input. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Tunya, for sharing your research and your findings with us. It was a great session. Yeah.
Thank you. I hope that you all found it to be valuable.
Very valuable. I think we had some good interaction here. And we will be sharing out the slides and the recording of the session. And am I missing any questions before I sign off? Nope, just thanks and welcome and congratulations to everybody on board.